Teacher whore! Preston Whitmore stood in the center of the classroom, his phone raised high, displaying screenshots. Everyone needs to know the truth about Miss Hayes. 30 students swiveled in their seats to stare at Madison Hayes, the new 28-year-old English teacher standing beside the whiteboard, her face draining of color. Preston, the student council president in his $500 uniform, smirked with practiced cruelty. Madison's lips parted as if to speak. Then she simply released a long, measured sigh. Not one person in that room could have imagined that single exhale had just activated a financial time bomb 3 years in the making. They thought they were hunting a frightened rabbit. Sometimes, though, rabbit fur merely disguises a lion waiting for its moment. The morning had started like any other at Westfield Preparatory Academy, where $75,000 tuition bought more than education. It purchased immunity. Preston Whitmore understood this equation perfectly. His father ran Whitmore Insurance Corporation, the largest insurance company in Connecticut. His mother sat on the school board. At 18, Preston wielded his family name like a weapon, and today he'd found a new target. If you've ever been cornered by someone who believes their money makes them untouchable, you know the suffocating feeling Madison faced. The way power can fill a room until there's no air left for truth. But sometimes, the hunted know something the hunters don't. Sometimes, they're exactly where they want to be. Madison had arrived at Westfield just 2 weeks earlier, replacing a veteran teacher who'd taken sudden early retirement. The official story cited health concerns. The whispered truth involved Preston's previous campaign against her. Mysterious photos appearing online, parents receiving anonymous emails until Mrs. Henderson broke under the pressure. Now Preston circled his new prey. He'd started small the first week. Snide comments during class, eye rolls when Madison spoke, recruiting others to his cause. By week 2, he was ready for total war. Look at this. Preston swiped through his phone, showing other students. I found her real background. The things she did before coming here? Disgusting. The images were expertly crafted deepfakes. Madison's face seamlessly edited onto compromising photos. In an era where artificial intelligence could rewrite reality, Preston had become a master of digital assassination. Madison watched him perform, noting how other students leaned away or leaned in, fear and fascination wrestling for dominance. She pulled out a slim black notebook and began writing. Preston's eyes narrowed at her calm response. Previous teachers had shouted, cried, or fled. This one took notes. What are you writing? He stepped closer, designer shoes clicking on linoleum. Documenting your shame? Just observing, Madison replied quietly. Please continue with your presentation, Preston. You seem to have everyone's attention. Her measured response threw him off balance. Where was the panic? The defensiveness? He'd prepared for tears, not this strange composure. Behind Madison's desk sat a leather briefcase with a combination lock, the kind government officials carried. Her laptop bore encryption software that would have looked more at home in a federal building than a high school. By lunchtime, Preston's whisper campaign had evolved into a social media blitzkrieg. The hashtag #@fire. Madison spread through Westfield's exclusive networks. Parents who'd barely noticed the new English teacher suddenly demanded meetings. Email chains multiplied like viruses, each iteration adding new allegations, new evidence, new outrage. Madison ate alone in her classroom, apparently oblivious to the storm building around her. She pulled out her phone. Not an iPhone like everyone else at Westfield, but a device with additional security features. Her fingers moved across the screen with practiced precision, entering a 12-digit code that opened an encrypted messaging app. Phase 1 initiated, she typed. Target taking bait. Preston burst through her door without knocking, flanked by his usual crew, lacrosse players and student government minions who'd learned that following Preston meant power by association. Enjoying your last lunch at Westfield? Preston's voice dripped satisfaction. My mom's already calling an emergency parent meeting. By tonight, you'll be packing. Madison looked up from her sandwich. That's interesting timing. Your father must be very busy today. What's that supposed to mean? Nothing at all. She took another bite, chewing thoughtfully. Though I imagine running a multi-billion-dollar insurance company requires constant attention. All those claims to process, all those policies to honor. Or not honor, as the case may be. Preston's smirk faltered for just a second. So quick his followers missed it. But Madison caught the flicker of uncertainty. She'd touched something he didn't expect her to know. You don't know anything about my father. Of course not, Madison agreed pleasantly. I'm just a simple English teacher. What could I possibly know about corporate structures, regulatory compliance, or federal oversight? The words hung in the air like a challenge Preston couldn't quite decipher. He'd come to intimidate. But somehow the conversation had shifted into territory that made him uncomfortable. Madison's eyes held something he'd never encountered in a target. Not fear, not anger, but patience. The kind of patience that suggested she was waiting for something specific. 3 o'clock, Preston announced, recovering his swagger. Parent meeting in the main auditorium. Better practice your goodbye speech. After they left, Madison made another notation in her black book. Then she opened her briefcase, revealing files labeled with alphanumeric codes. One bore the header, WE 2019 SEC 047. She smiled and closed it again. The afternoon classes proceeded with artificial normalcy. Students whispered and stared, but Madison taught Shakespearean tragedies as if her own wasn't unfolding. When she discussed hubris, excessive pride before a fall, several students noticed her glance at Preston's empty seat. He was busy elsewhere, orchestrating her destruction. By 2:45 p.m., the parking lot filled with luxury vehicles. Mercedes, BMWs, and Teslas arrived like an armada of privilege. Parents who usually sent assistants to school functions appeared in person, faces set with manufactured concern. Preston had done his work well. Nothing motivated Westfield parents like threats to their children's carefully curated environment. Madison stood at her classroom window, observing the gathering storm. Her phone buzzed with a message. All units in position, awaiting your signal. She typed back, hold until Phase 2 confirmation. The auditorium hummed with indignation when Madison entered at precisely 3 p.m. 200 parents turned to stare, some with curiosity, most with condemnation. Preston sat in the front row beside his mother, Eleanor Whitmore, whose perfectly styled blonde hair and designer suit announced her status before she spoke. Principal Wheeler, a thin man who'd learned long ago that wealthy donors owned his spine, gestured Madison to a single chair facing the crowd. The positioning was deliberate. One woman against an army. Thank you all for coming, Wheeler began, sweat already beading on his forehead. We're here to address serious concerns about Miss Hayes. Lies, Eleanor Whitmore interrupted, standing with practiced authority. Let's call them what they are. Credible allegations about a teacher with a questionable past who somehow slipped through our screening process. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Preston pulled up his phone, projecting images onto the auditorium screen. The deepfakes, the fabricated documents, the fictional history he'd crafted. Madison remained silent, taking notes in her black book. The very act seemed to unnerve some parents. What was she writing? Why wasn't she defending herself? During this character assassination, something interesting happened. Madison pulled out a different device, a professional-grade digital recorder used by federal investigators. The machine could capture conversations from 50 feet away, automatically transcribe them, and create voice-print analysis that would hold up in federal court. Every threat, every conspiracy being discussed was being preserved with legal timestamps. "This is professional recording equipment," one parent whispered to another. "Why does a teacher have that?" Eleanor Whitmore noticed the device too. "Are you recording this without consent?" "Connecticut is a one-party consent state," Madison replied, her first words since entering. "Only one person needs to be aware of recording. However, this is a public meeting in a school facility where there's no expectation of privacy anyway." The legal precision of her response sent uncomfortable ripples through the room. This didn't sound like a frightened teacher. It sounded like someone who knew exactly what they were doing. "Regardless," Eleanor pressed on, "the evidence speaks for itself. My son has documented a pattern of inappropriate behavior. Your son has created digital forgeries," Madison interrupted calmly. "Rather impressive ones, actually. The AI software he used typically costs several $1,000s. I wonder how a high school student afforded it." Preston shot to his feet. "You can't prove they're fake." "Actually, I can." Madison opened her briefcase and pulled out a folder. "Digital forensics is quite advanced these days. Every image has metadata. Every edit leaves traces. But we're not here to discuss your computer skills, Preston. We're here because you wanted an audience for my destruction." She stood, no longer willing to remain seated like a defendant. "You've given everyone quite a show. The rumors, the social media campaign, the parent mobilization, textbook character assassination. Your father must be proud." "Leave my father out of this." Preston's face flushed red. "Interesting response." Madison made another note. "Tell me, Preston, when you decided to destroy my career, did you research who I was before Westfield, or did you assume I was just another weak teacher you could break?" The room fell silent. Even Eleanor looked uncertain now. Madison had flipped the script. Suddenly, Preston was the one being questioned. "I know exactly who you are," Preston snarled. "A nobody teacher who—" 3 years ago, Madison cut him off. The Securities and Exchange Commission opened an investigation into insurance fraud. The lead prosecutor spent 2 years building a case against one of Connecticut's largest companies. The investigation was suspended, not closed, due to insufficient evidence. Not because the crimes didn't exist, but because the witnesses were too frightened to testify. The color drained from Eleanor Whitmore's face. "That prosecutor took a leave of absence," Madison continued, "decided to try teaching instead. Funny how life works. She ended up at the exact school where the CEO's son studied. What are the odds?" Preston's phone clattered to the floor. Around the auditorium, parents shifted uncomfortably. Some began recording with their own phones, sensing the meeting had taken an unexpected turn. Madison looked directly at Preston. "You gave me exactly what 2 years of investigation couldn't. Recorded admission of your father's ability to handle problems. Your own words, live-streamed to 5,000 viewers. My dad can deal with anyone. That's conspiracy to obstruct justice, Preston, and you broadcasted it yourself." The auditorium doors burst open. Federal agents in dark suits entered with the precision of a choreographed dance. FBI and SEC badges gleamed under the lights. "Madison Hayes, SEC Financial Crimes Division," Madison announced, pulling out her credentials. "This meeting is over." Eleanor Whitmore's perfectly composed face crumbled. "You can't— This is entrapment." "Entrapment requires inducement to commit a crime you wouldn't otherwise commit," Madison replied. I simply existed. Your son chose to attack me, chose to brag about his father's power, chose to demonstrate exactly how the Whitmore family handles threats. I just took notes. The lead FBI agent approached Eleanor. Ma'am, we have warrants for all Whitmore Corporation facilities and digital records. I suggest you contact your attorney. Preston stood frozen, his world collapsing in real time. The hunter had become prey, but more than that, he'd been prey all along. Madison Hayes hadn't stumbled into his crosshairs by accident. She'd painted the target on herself and waited for him to take the shot. 48 hours, Madison said quietly, gathering her belongings. That's how long you have before your father's empire crumbles. Use them wisely. She walked toward the exit, pausing beside Preston. Your homework for Monday, if you're still here, is a 5-page essay on dramatic irony. You know, when the audience understands something, the character doesn't. You should have plenty of personal experience to draw from. The last thing Preston heard before the agents escorted his mother out was the sound of Madison's heels clicking down the hallway. Steady, measured, inevitable. Just like the justice she'd waited 3 years to serve. The next 48 hours unfolded with the precision of a Swiss watch, each gear turning exactly as Madison Hayes had designed 3 years earlier. While Preston Whitmore sat in his family's mansion, watching his life disintegrate through news alerts and frozen bank accounts, Madison returned to her sparse apartment and opened a bottle of wine she'd been saving since 2019. Her real apartment bore no resemblance to the modest teacher's quarters one might expect. Multiple monitors lined one wall, displaying financial markets, news feeds, and encrypted communications. The sophisticated setup looked more like a command center than a living room. She settled into her ergonomic chair and watched the Whitmore empire burn. At 6 a.m. Thursday morning, simultaneous raids struck 12 Whitmore Corporation offices across 3 states. FBI agents in tactical gear stormed through marble lobbies, while SEC investigators seized servers containing decades of financial records. News helicopters circled the Hartford headquarters as employees were escorted out, carrying cardboard boxes, their corporate badges confiscated at the door. Preston watched from his bedroom window as unmarked vans filled his circular driveway. His father, Richard Whitmore, emerged from his home office, looking like he'd aged 10 years overnight. The man who'd terrorized boardrooms and crushed competitors shuffled toward the agents like a defeated general surrendering his sword. "Don't say anything," Richard muttered to his son as handcuffs clicked around his wrists. Not one word without lawyers. But Preston had already said too much. His live stream boasting about his father's power had provided probable cause for warrants that might have taken years to obtain otherwise. In trying to destroy Madison Hayes, he'd handed her the ammunition she'd spent 3 years searching for. The financial forensics software on Madison's screens painted a devastating picture. The specialized program, used by major law firms and costing millions in licensing fees, traced money through labyrinthine shell companies and offshore accounts with artificial intelligence precision. Each transaction appeared as a node in an expanding web of fraud. $500 million in denied claims, policies canceled through manufactured loopholes, families destroyed to boost quarterly profits. The AI automatically generated visual charts so clear that even a jury of laypeople would understand the scope of criminality. Madison sipped her wine and smiled. The software had just flagged another pattern: connections between Whitmore Corporation and 6 other insurance companies. The investigation would expand far beyond what she'd initially uncovered. By Thursday afternoon, Preston arrived at school to find his designated parking spot occupied by someone else's Honda Civic. The security guard who usually waved him through now checked his ID with uncomfortable scrutiny. In the hallways, Students who'd feared him for 3 years suddenly discovered their spines. Whispers followed him like smoke. His father's mugshot had gone viral. The family assets were frozen. Yale had already called about reassessing his early admission. He stumbled into Madison's classroom, finding her calmly grading papers as if she hadn't just orchestrated his family's downfall. "You destroyed everything," Preston's voice cracked. "My whole life. Gone." Madison looked up with the same patient expression she'd worn during his attacks. "I destroyed nothing, Preston. I simply held up a mirror. Your family destroyed themselves long before I arrived. This is your fault." He slammed his fist on her desk, scattering essays. "Sit down." Her voice carried quiet authority. "Your tantrum phase is over." Something in her tone made him collapse into a front-row seat. The mighty Preston Whitmore, who'd ruled Westfield through fear and wealth, now looked like what he'd always been, a scared 18-year-old who'd mistaken his father's money for his own power. "Let me tell you about Sarah Chen," Madison said, pulling a file from her briefcase. "Age 9, leukemia diagnosis. Your father's company denied her claim for experimental treatment, citing a technicality in subsection 47B of their policy. She died 6 months later." Preston's face went pale. "Michael Rodriguez," she continued, producing another file, "lost his home after Whitmore Corporation refused hurricane damage coverage. The adjuster, following your father's direct orders, classified wind damage as flood damage to invoke an exclusion clause. His family lived in their car for 8 months. File after file landed on the desk. Names, faces, stories of families destroyed by Whitmore Corporation's systematic fraud. Preston stared at the mounting evidence of suffering his luxury life had been built upon. "I spent 2 years documenting every victim," Madison said. 2 years building a case that should have brought justice. But your father's lawyers were too good, his connections too strong, his threats too effective. Witnesses disappeared or recanted. The investigation stalled." "So you came here," Preston whispered, understanding finally dawning. "You came for me." "I came for justice. You simply provided the opportunity." Madison gathered the files with practiced efficiency. "Your ego, your cruelty, your need to dominate. You inherited more than money from your father. You inherited his fatal flaw, the belief that power means impunity." Friday morning brought the final blow. Preston arrived at school to find his mother's Mercedes being loaded onto a repo truck. Their bank accounts frozen pending investigation. Even the small checking account Eleanor had opened for Preston's emergencies was inaccessible. The family who'd dined at $100 per plate restaurants now qualified for the free lunch program. In the cafeteria, Preston stood with an orange plastic tray, the kind reserved for financial aid students, while his former followers averted their eyes. The same boys who'd helped him torment others now treated him like he was invisible. He sat alone at a corner table, understanding for the first time what he'd put others through. Madison observed from the faculty table, noting how quickly the ecosystem adjusted. Already, new power dynamics were forming. Harper Sinclair, daughter of a state senator, had begun gathering Preston's former circle around her, the cycle preparing to repeat itself. That afternoon, Madison taught her class on Greek tragedies with particular emphasis on hubris. "The hero's excessive pride blinds them to their vulnerability," she explained, writing on the board. "They mistake temporary advantage for permanent superiority. The very characteristics that elevate them become the instruments of their downfall." Preston sat in the back corner, frantically taking notes. Without money for college, his grades suddenly mattered. Every scholarship application would require essays, recommendations, proof that he was more than his father's son. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The boy who'd tried to destroy a teacher now desperately needed one. After class, Madison found Preston waiting by her desk. "I need a recommendation letter," he said, unable to meet her eyes, "for financial aid applications." The moment hung between them, heavy with poetic justice. Madison could destroy his future with a single no, completing the revenge Preston had brought upon himself. "I'll consider it," she said finally, "if you complete an extra assignment. 20,000 words on restorative justice and the impact of white-collar crime on communities. Interview at least 10 families affected by insurance fraud. Due in 3 weeks." Preston's shoulders slumped at the monumental task. "That's impossible. Your father made $50 million in bonuses last year while denying chemotherapy to children. Tell me again what's impossible." Monday morning arrived with Preston's essay. Not 20,000 words, but 25,000. Meticulously researched and devastatingly personal. He'd interviewed 16 families, including Sarah Chen's parents. Their stories had transformed him in ways his family's bankruptcy couldn't. Madison read it during her free period, noting the genuine anguish in Preston's words as he grappled with his complicity. The boy who'd weaponized technology to destroy reputations had finally turned that lens on himself. "It's a start," she told him, handing back the essay with extensive notes. "Real change takes more than words." 2 months passed. Richard Whitmore pled guilty to 47 counts of fraud, accepting 25 years in federal prison rather than risk trial. Whitmore Corporation dissolved, its assets distributed to victims through a court-appointed fund. The Hayes family moved from their mansion to a 2-bedroom apartment in Hartford, where Eleanor worked as a grocery store cashier, and Preston juggled 3 part-time jobs. Madison continued teaching, her true identity now campus legend. Students who might have become bullies thought twice, knowing their teacher had toppled an empire with patience and precision. Her classroom became a sanctuary where power meant knowledge, not money or connections. But in her black notebook, new names appeared. Harper Sinclair's campaign against the math teacher followed Preston's playbook too closely for coincidence. Another entitled Child Testing Boundaries, believing wealth provided immunity. One afternoon, as Madison graded papers, her encrypted phone buzzed. A message from her former colleague at the SEC. "Pharmaceutical division needs someone with your skills. Sinclair Pharma price-fixing investigation stalled. Interested?" She glanced at Harper in the hallway, watching the girl torment a scholarship student. The cycle continuing, just with different players. Madison opened her notebook to a fresh page and wrote, "Operation Sinclair. Insurance. Complete. Pharmaceutical. Pending." That evening, a new teacher arrived for an interview. Ms. Rodriguez, applying for the vacant math position. Her credentials were impressive. MIT doctorate, published researcher, glowing recommendations. Principal Wheeler hired her immediately, desperate for stability after the scandal. Only Madison noticed the telling details. The way Rodriguez's eyes swept the hallway, cataloging exits and camera positions, the government-grade encryption on her laptop, the slight bulge of a recording device in her blazer pocket. Another hunter, disguising herself as prey. As Rodriguez toured the building, Harper Sinclair strutted past, sneering at the pathetic new teacher. The woman simply smiled and made a notation in her own black book. Madison watched from her doorway as the two predators sized each other up, one obvious in her cruelty, the other patient in her deception. She thought of Preston, now volunteering at a legal aid clinic helping insurance fraud victims. Sometimes the burned learned to stop playing with fire. Sometimes they simply passed the matches to someone else. "Remember, students," Madison had written on her board that morning, "in literature as in life, villains always write their own endings." The words remained as Harper Sinclair began her campaign against Ms. Rodriguez, unaware she was authoring her own family's destruction. In the great game of justice, there were no final victories, only the next player stepping up to the board, convinced they'd learned from their predecessors' mistakes.